as Mary said, she said the solstice. I don't know if I can commit to saying the solstice. It's beautiful when she says the solstice, but I'm so used to saying the solstice, so I'm just going to go with that, and we can pretend that that's my version of tomato. But today is the winter solstice, and what I find to be a bit strange about today being the winter solstice is that it also means that today is the first day of winter, right? Which tells us that 2/3 of December is fall. And I don't know if it's just me, but does that not feel weird to anyone, right? That most of December is autumn, technically? I don't know. I find that to be a little strange. It's kind of like avocado not being a vegetable, but being a fruit. Yeah. We know it's true. We've been told it's true, but it just doesn't sit right, So I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But the thing about the solstice is that it is a universal experience. It is a cosmic experience. It is something that has, been true of all cultures throughout human history, is this experience of the way in our relationship to the sun changes throughout the year, and particularly as it returns to us in winter, right? That we see the return of the sun. We see the rebirth of light in our year. And these themes fit very well. They connect us naturally to the Christmas story. Return of the sun, rebirth of light. Now, let's back up a little bit, because maybe you haven't been here for the rest of this series, or maybe you missed a week or two. We've been in this series called The Hidden Underbelly of Christmas, and essentially what we've been talking about are some of the hidden themes of this time of year, of the Christmas tradition, things that we do not necessarily spend much time on, things that we tend to overlook. In particular, our culture overlooks, religion often overlooks, but things that are really worth paying attention to and noticing. So the first week, we talked about not just St. Nick, but the real St. Nick, not just the Santa Claus that we often see in the movies and depicted on advertisements, but the real St. Nick, who was a source of radical generosity in a way that stood up to an empire. And then last week we talked about a holiday. We talked about Saturnalia, an ancient Roman celebration that partially forms the basis for our modern day Christmas tradition. And what we found about Saturnalia was that it was actually about reversing the social order, flipping society on its head in order to create a sense of hope and possibility of what could be. And so what we said last week is that there's not one, but two Roman holidays, two Roman celebrations, from which we actually get our modern day Christmas tradition. So Saturnalia was in many ways where we get some of the things like feasting and lights and gift giving. And it was also celebrated around this time of year. But there was a Roman holiday specifically celebrated on December 25th prior to Christmas. And this is sort of the basis and foundation for why Christmas is on December 25th. And this holiday was called Sol Invictus. The translation for this in Latin is the Unconquered Sun. Sol, Sun, Invictus, Unconquered. And it connects directly to the solstice, right? When we think about it, this assurance that the sun will return to us in winter, that the light will return to us in the midst of darkness, that whatever we are facing, the sun will always rise again, at least for the next 5 billion years, from what I'm told. And so what we've been looking at, and what we started looking at last week, was the fact that in 4th century Rome, there was a shift into Christianity being the state religion. It went from being this underground religion to the state religion overnight. And so what was done, the choice was made to rebrand Roman festivals, Roman holidays into Christian tradition, because the Romans were already used to celebrating at these times. And so we talked about the first of these two, Saturnalia, last week. And Saturnalia was, in many ways, a celebration of Saturn, who is a god from part of the Roman mythology. And Sol Invictus is also part of that, but as time went on, the Romans shifted from their ancient gods, and they moved into seeing the sun itself as the divine, or as a deity. And so there's some scholars who talk about this and what Sol Invictus meant to them. It embodied the eternal return of light, a deity whose very nature proclaimed that darkness and disorder could never finally triumph. So it was a celebration at this time of year, right, really well timed with the solstice, about the return of light, about the victory of the sun over darkness and disorder. And so it shouldn't be hard for us to find a connection between Sol Invictus and Christmas today, right? Both are about a victorious light that comes in the midst of darkness, that comes in the midst of cold and maybe even hopelessness, not just seasons of the year, but seasons of the soul. Says another scholar, Christians saw in the sun's return precisely the kind of cosmic sign that resonated with their belief in light overcoming darkness. So we see a natural connection between Christmas and Sol Invictus, but there is also this relationship that goes further back, that long before Christmas, long before Sol Invictus, cultures have been celebrating and really orienting their entire lives around the winter solstice, a celebration of the return of the light. And we remember that for many ancient people, the equinoxes, the solstices, were how they understood themselves and time itself. So when we can recognize together that the origin of Christmas being celebrated on December 25th predates Christianity, it doesn't have to take away from anything when it comes to tradition or spiritual meaning. Perhaps it can actually imbue Christmas with meaning. Rather than there being some kind of forced connection between Sol Invictus and Christmas, we can see that there's actually a natural overlap between the themes of Christmas and the themes of Sol Invictus and the solstice. There's a synergy there, or as one scholar says, the imagery of the unconquered sun became a natural metaphor for Christ as light. Not a borrowing, but a recognition of the same truth about the world. So let's kind of back up and put it into modern terms, because for us, right, in our modern world, our relationship to the sun is quite different than people who lived centuries and millennia ago, right? We have electricity, we have heat. And so we're not so determined and dependent on the sun and its cycles and its movement for how we want to live and orchestrate our lives. And then, of course, you have us in southern Arizona who have this completely different relationship to the sun than other people in our country, I would say, right? Like in summer, where a lot of people are celebrating the sun, we are hiding from it. It is not friend, it is annihilation for a lot of us, right? Maybe you're like me, and in the summer you use the sun as your dryer, right? You don't need to use your dryer, you just put your clothes out and things can dry within 5 to 10 minutes, I find. Maybe you're someone who uses the sun as oven, right? Like you put cookies on your dashboard, and they're, or if you've been to El Charro, they have like carne seca, which is like the sun is actually the main, is the oven. So it's pretty remarkable, but we're pretty far removed in a lot of ways from understanding how ancient cultures viewed the sun, particularly in relationship to time. See, if we go back just a little over 100 years ago, the sun was how our ancestors understood themselves, both on a daily basis, but on an annual level as well. For 99.9% of human history, time was understood on a daily basis, not by the minutes and the hours and the ticking of a clock, but the sun's position of the sky, right? This only changed pretty recently, like in the 1800s. Before then, most of human existence, we understood kind of when you were meeting up with someone, you would say like, hey, dawn, or when the sun's highest in the sky, which I find to be kind of like, in our day and age, a little inconvenient. Like imagine if we were moving to two services, right, and we didn't have minutes or hours. I would have to say like, all right, come to our service, which is either at first dawn or at when the sun is like a quarter of the way through the sky. And we just have to hope that people find their way here, you know what I mean? And park their horse and buggy in our lot, I told last service, like, my 1800s humor is not all there yet. I'm working on it. I'm better with modern topics, so bear with me. But That was 99.9% of human history, right? And then you look at 97% of human history, which has been spent not using the months of the calendar to determine our position in the year, but again, solar events and how that affected agriculture, right? So you wouldn't invite someone to your wedding in April. You would say, hey, come to my wedding after first thaw or something like that, you know? We've been an agricultural people for thousands and thousands of years. For most of recent human history, until very, very recently with the advent of technology and industry, we've been primarily an agricultural species. And for these types of people, the sun has not just meant light and warmth, but it's meant life, right? Survival, sustenance. And from that context, the darkness of winter is felt on many levels. It's not just, oh, how long of a day do we have, but it's about survival and well-being. And so the return of the sun, the rebirth of the sun, is a universal symbol, right? It finds people across all cultures, across time, across various languages, a symbol of rebirth and renewal and hope. That after the longest night, something new is born. Says a scholar about Sol Invictus, the sun's daily and annual rebirths made it a powerful symbol of victory over darkness, of hope, and renewal. How many of us need some hope and some promise of renewal today? Maybe you can look back at a moment in life when you were facing some darkness, when you were facing a long night, and maybe in that moment it was enough encouragement to recognize that the sun will rise again tomorrow, the sun will be reborn tomorrow, and maybe with the promise of the new day is also a promise of possibility, of change, of hope, that with the promise of tomorrow is the hope that something might be different, something might change in my situation. If I could just endure through the night. And if you felt that before, friends, I want to affirm for you, this is not just wishful thinking. This is actually a reality embedded into nature, embedded into our experience on this planet and in this universe. Says one scholar about Sol Invictus that it is a promise built into the cosmos itself. It's not simply this made-up holiday. And so I want to ask you something. What is feeling dark for you in your life? What is feeling cold? What is feeling bleak? Where in your life are you finding yourself deep in a winter of sorts? Not the Tucson winter, that's amazing, right? But just pretend that I'm talking about like a Minnesota winter or something, you know. You Minnesotans out there are like, hey. But where are you deep in this, right? In the cold, in the darkness? And can you have faith that the sun is still there, right? As Mary said, it's there behind the gray, behind the clouds. Maybe you can't see it yet, but can you believe that it's being reborn? That it's on its way back, that the longest night has passed. See, this is exactly what the Christmas story is about in many ways, right? It's a story about a people who have been oppressed over and over and over by empire after empire after empire. And where we pick up the Christmas story, they're under Roman rule, the Romans being the strongest, most powerful military complex that the world had ever seen up until that point. And this is the long night within which the Christmas story begins, and when the divine enters into the fray. So we see it in the cosmos, we see it in tradition, and we can see it in our own lives, right? We all face our own version of a longest night. But the promise of the solstice, the promise of Sol Invictus, it's still there. And it's there reminding you that darkness does not need to have the final word, just as the Christmas story was a reminder that empire and oppressive power does not have the final word. Says Joseph Campbell, the world's, foremost authority on myth and archetype. He says the birth of the sun at the solstice is the archetype of unconquered light. The world's assurance that darkness is not final. Let's take a moment and let's think of the solstice or the sol Invictus as a birth of sorts, the birth of the sun. That's happening right now at this very time of year that we are in. Right? And if we can see it as a birth, what we remember is that all birth starts small and fragile and tender. Right? Just like we have this preeminent image of the baby Jesus around this time of year. And so when we think about what might be being born within us, right? That hope that is being birthed within us right now, right? Maybe it is fragile and tender, and it needs some gentleness from you. It needs and requires you to nurture it as a newborn, right? Maybe it's not a flame, it's just a flicker, it's just an ember. Can you nurture it? Can you treat it as though it is new birth? And perhaps as you do, you are fanning a flame. You are watching something rise and grow and experience renewal within yourself. And perhaps as you do, what you start to encounter is that there is a part of you and a part of me that is infinite, and it is unconquered. It is an unconquered soul, right? It is invincible. It is safe. It is whole. Jung talked about this self. Carl Jung, he would have used the language of the self. He called it the capital S self, right? A lot of us would use the word soul, S-O-U-L, or whatever you choose, whatever language works for you. But when Carl Jung talked about it, he connected this to the sun. He said the sun is the most fitting symbol of the capital S self, radiant, indestructible, and triumphant over darkness. So here's my invitation for us this Christmas. This Christmas, may we see Christ, or may we see the sol Invictus or the solstice, not just as something happening outside of us or external to us, but as something within. That we see that we, in fact, are the sol Invictus. That within us, there is an unconquerable light. Or as the existentialist Camus once called it, an invincible summer. He said, in the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me, there lay an invincible summer. I'm going to invite the band to join us on stage to sing one last song. And as we mentioned before, today is the last official Sunday of the year that we'll be meeting. Of course, we will be here on Wednesday, but as being the last Sunday of our year, I wanted to just invite us all to take a moment and reflect on the year past. Perhaps some of the trials and challenges we may have faced throughout the year. I know that for a lot of us, if you look back to this time last year, that you were looking ahead, thinking about moving into 2025 with some fear and trepidation. And we have faced a difficult year together on many fronts. But I also want to remind you that there was still laughter, right? That you still made art, that you still grew flowers, that you still found healing, that you still shared love. And maybe if you look back at the light that showed up for you in the midst of a dark time, maybe you could recognize that in the depth of winter, you found an invincible summer within yourself. And so as we end 2025, I want to just take a moment for us to reflect on the year past. We'll sing a song that is commonly sung at year-end celebrations. And as we do, not only do I invite you to sing along if you so choose, but there will also be some images on the screen that are glimpses of your year past, that I invited our community this past week to submit photos, if you so chose, that represented things that you were grateful for, things that gave you hope, things that were lights in the darkness. And so as we close today, as we sing this last song, would you take a moment and reflect on the year past and the invincible summer that arose for you?
Should old acquaintance be forgot and old lang syne, for old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. Surely you'll buy your mantle, and surely I'll buy mine. We'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. You have run around the slopes and picked the daisies fine, and we have wandered barefoot in old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. To have paddles in the stream from morning sun till dawn, but seas between us broad and roared in old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. There's a hand, my trusty friend, and in the hand of thine, we'll take a right good little draught for old lang syne. For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne.
In 1964, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison for being an activist and protester against apartheid in South Africa, which was a decades-long, systematic, institutionalized racism in their country. And so he was first sent to a place called Robben Island, which was a prison particularly cruel and isolated. And yet, in those incredibly disempowering and hopeless conditions, Mandela actually became a leader among the prisoners. He became a source of hope and encouragement and inspiration. He kept other people going. And it was later discovered that what gave him hope, part of how he kept going, was there was a poem that he often read to himself and to others. And this poem was called Invictus, which we now understand, based on our conversation today, to mean unconquered in Latin. Invictus was written almost a century before, in 1875, by a man named William Ernest Henley, who wrote it in many ways out of the health difficulties that he was struggling with. And I want to read, not the full poem, but just an excerpt from Invictus, these words that kept Nelson Mandela going in the darkest times of his life. You might recognize some of these words. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I think whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Nelson Mandela did not end up spending his entire life in prison. He was released, and after which he negotiated the end of apartheid, later becoming the first black prime minister of South Africa. And yet when we think on how he survived his conditions and overcame, we're reminded of this beautiful flower of an idea that within us we have an unconquerable soul, an invincible summer. So friends, that's my hope for us and my encouragement for all of us, that may we find that within ourselves, no matter what it is we might be facing, both as individuals and collectively as a country and as a world. This Christmas, friends, we remember that the sun will rise again, and with it will come hope, possibility, rebirth, and renewal.